The amber glow of the Anchor and Eagle's neon sign cast restless shadows across rain-slicked concrete, its electrical hum a metallic heartbeat in the Virginia night. Inside, the air hung thick with decades of accumulated smoke, spilled beer, and the particular brand of testosterone that gathered wherever young warriors came to decompress from the weight of their calling. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Mitchell occupied the corner booth like a ghost at a wake. Her presence was so deliberately unremarkable that she might have been furniture, save for the faint blue glow emanating from the device in her hands. To the casual observer, she was just another off-duty sailor nursing a club soda and killing time with a tablet. They saw a small woman compact and economical in her movements, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a regulation bun that did nothing to soften the sharp intelligence in her green eyes. What they didn't see was the manual she was studying. The cover bore Cyrillic text and a faded Soviet star, the binding cracked from decades of careful use. Signals Intelligence and Electromagnetic Deception Field Manual for Special Communications Units, 1983. The pages were yellowed with age margins, dense with annotations in two different hands, the original in faded blue ink, the additions in black ballpoint that had grown progressively more urgent over the years. Sarah's finger traced a particular passage about frequency masking techniques, the same passage her father had underlined in red ink 20 years ago. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell had been methodical in his study cross-referencing Soviet doctrine with observed enemy behavior in the mountains of Afghanistan. His notes revealed a mind trying to solve a puzzle that would ultimately cost him his life. Frequency hopping pattern, observed 15 Octa02. Read one margin note in her father's careful handwriting. Coordination too precise for standard insurgent comms. Russian advisors. Below it in different ink, pattern repeated Yo3, Novio2. IED timing suggests central coordination. Need to understand their crypto. The final note dated 3 days before his death was barely legible. They're not just using our own tactics against us. They're using tactics we never learned. Sarah could almost hear his voice explaining the concept during one of their weekend training sessions in the Virginia woods back when she was 7 and he was preparing for what would become his final deployment. Those Saturday mornings had been their special time, father and daughter bonding over radio frequencies and signal analysis while her mother slept in. The key isn't to find the signal, baby girl, he had said, adjusting the knobs on an old military radio they'd salvaged from a surplus store. Any fool with the right equipment can find a signal. The trick is to understand the silence between the signals. That's where the real information lives. As she hadn't understood then. At 7, she'd been more interested in the way the radio crackled to life, the magic of voices emerging from static. But her father had been patient, teaching her to hear patterns in the noise, to recognize the difference between random interference and deliberate deception. By the time she was 10, she could identify frequency-hopping patterns by ear alone. Now at 29, she understood that those weekend lessons had been more than bonding time. Her father had been preparing her, passing on knowledge that went beyond standard military communications training. He had been teaching her to think like the enemy, to see electronic warfare not as a technical challenge, but as a psychological one. The manual wasn't just a technical document. It was an inheritance passed down from a father who never made it home from Helmand Province to a daughter who had chosen to follow his path into the most demanding units the military had to offer. Sarah had carried it through Hell Week, through the grueling months of Bud's training that followed through every deployment where electronic warfare meant the difference between mission success and body bags. She remembered the night she'd decided to volunteer for SEAL training 3 months after receiving news of her father's death. Her mother had begged her to reconsider, to choose a safer path, but Sarah had felt the pull of unfinished business. Her father had died trying to understand an enemy that conventional thinking couldn't decode. She would finish what he'd started. The training had been designed to break down candidates and rebuild them as something harder. Of the 180 candidates who started her Bud's class, only 23 had graduated. She had been the only woman, a fact that earned her both grudging respect and constant scrutiny. Every evolution had been a test not just of her physical capabilities, but of her right to be there at all. The instructors had pushed her harder than the men looking for any sign of weakness that would justify washing her out. They'd found none. When others quit during surf torture, she'd use meditation techniques her father had taught her, focusing on frequency analysis problems to keep her mind sharp while her body endured. When others failed land navigation exercises, she'd applied lessons learned during those childhood weekends, reading the electromagnetic signature of the terrain to supplement her compass work. Master Chief Frank Sullivan had been her primary instructor during the advanced phases of training. At 62, Sullivan was a legend in the special operations community, a man who had served 38 years and earned his reputation during the final phases of the Cold War. He had worked signals intelligence when the Soviet Union was still a going concern, when electronic warfare meant the difference between peaceful coexistence and nuclear annihilation. Sullivan had recognized something in Sarah's approach to electronic warfare that went beyond standard training. She didn't just understand the technical aspects of signal analysis. She understood the human psychology behind electronic deception. When other students saw random noise, she saw intentional patterns. When they saw jamming, she saw communication. Mitchell, he had told her during her final evaluation, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. You think like they do. That's not something we can teach. Either you have it or you don't. Your father would be proud. The validation had meant more to her than her graduation certificate, more than the trident that marked her as one of the few women to complete SEAL training. Sullivan had known her father's work, had read his reports from Afghanistan, and understood that Sarah carried more than just genetic predisposition for the work. She carried a mission. A burst of laughter from the bar's main room interrupted her concentration. 3 Marines had claimed the high-top table nearest to her booth, their dress blue uniforms indicating they were either coming from or heading to some formal function. The largest of the 3, a man whose neck was almost as wide as his head, was regaling his companions with a story that involved increasingly animated gestures and a voice that carried across the room like artillery fire. Gunnery Sergeant Rex Morgan was the kind of Marine who measured his worth in decibels and demanded attention like oxygen. At 42, he had built his career on the foundation of controlled aggression that made force reconnaissance units effective, but somewhere along the way, the control had given way to pure ego. His ribbon rack spoke of competence tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, a Bronze Star, multiple commendations for valor under fire. But his personality spoke of something else entirely, a man who had confused respect earned through service with dominance demanded through intimidation. His 2 companions orbited him like satellites around a planet. Sergeant Mike Thompson, 28, and built like a linebacker, had the eager expression of someone still trying to prove himself worthy of Morgan's approval. His relatively sparse ribbon rack suggested he was newer to the force recon community, probably transferred in from a regular infantry unit and still adapting to the culture of elite operations. Sergeant Danny Walsh, barely 26 and carrying the lean hunger of a recent promotion, watched his senior NCO with the devotion of an acolyte. Walsh had the look of someone who had grown up on stories of Marine Corps heroism and found himself living out those stories in the presence of men he considered legends. So there we were. Morgan continued, his voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. 30 clicks into Indian country, and this Army captain starts talking about how his intel nerds back at the FOB had everything mapped out for us. He paused for effect, letting his audience lean in. I told him, sir, with all due respect, your intel nerds never humped a ruck through that valley. We have. The story continued, embellished with each retelling, but Sarah had heard enough variations of it from enough different sources to know that truth and Gunnery Sergeant Morgan's version of events maintained only a passing relationship. She returned her attention to the manual, specifically to a section about polymorphic encryption that her father had flagged with a question mark, and the annotation, saw this in '03, Russians. The question mark had haunted her for years. Her father had been killed 3 months after writing that note, his convoy struck by an IED that intelligence later attributed to sophisticated coordination between insurgent cells, the kind of coordination that required advanced communications security, the kind that matched the theoretical models outlined in Soviet-era manuals exactly like the one she was studying. Sarah pulled out her personal tablet and opened a secure connection to the Naval War College's digital library. Cross-referencing the manual's technical specifications with known Russian electronic warfare capabilities, she began to see patterns that others had missed. The insurgents hadn't just been using improvised explosive devices. They had been using improvised electronic warfare, applying decades-old Soviet doctrine to asymmetric combat in ways that American intelligence had failed to anticipate. The realization sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the bar's air conditioning. If her analysis was correct, her father hadn't died in a random insurgent attack. He had died because he had gotten too close to understanding something that powerful people wanted to remain hidden. The sophistication of the communications networks he had documented suggested not just Russian advisors, but active Russian intelligence involvement in anti-American operations. She made a mental note to contact Master Chief Sullivan in the morning. This was the kind of discovery that needed to be handled through proper channels by people who understood the implications of what she was seeing. Sullivan had the connections and the credibility to ensure that her father's work received the attention it deserved. Well, look what we got here. The voice cut through her concentration like a buzzsaw. Sarah looked up to find Gunnery Sergeant Morgan standing beside her table, his bulk casting a shadow across her workspace. Thompson and Walsh had moved to flank her booth, effectively blocking any easy exit. Their positioning was casual but deliberate, the kind of tactical awareness that came from years of small unit operations. Morgan's breath carried the sharp tang of whiskey, suggesting this wasn't his first stop of the evening. His face was flushed, whether from alcohol or from the adrenaline of what he clearly saw as an opportunity to demonstrate his dominance in front of his subordinates. The predatory gleam in his eyes suggested that he had identified Sarah as suitable prey for whatever game he was playing. Little Navy nerd all lost in her picture books, he continued his tone, carrying the particular brand of condescension reserved for those he considered beneath notice. He leaned forward, his shadow falling across her tablet screen, the smell of cheap whiskey and testosterone rolling off him in waves. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Threat assessment and escape route, analysis, force multiplication considerations. 3 subjects intoxicated blocking egress, superior size and reach. Civilian environment, multiple witnesses, legal constraints on response options. She cataloged these factors in the space between heartbeats while maintaining the appearance of calm attention. She did not look up immediately. Instead, she saved her work with deliberate precision, closed the tablet's protective case, and placed both devices carefully in her bag. Only then did she raise her eyes to meet Morgan's gaze. What he saw there should have given him pause. These were not the eyes of someone intimidated or impressed by his display of dominance. They were the eyes of a professional conducting a threat assessment. "Evening," she said simply, her voice carrying the particular neutrality of someone who had learned to navigate hostile environments without escalation. The simple greeting seemed to catch Morgan off balance. He had expected deference fear, or at least some acknowledgement of his superior size and aggressive positioning. Instead, he got the kind of polite disinterest usually reserved for door-to-door salesmen. The unexpected response threw him off script, forcing him to recalibrate his approach. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Thompson interjected, stepping closer to the table. His voice carried the eager edge of someone trying to impress his superior while working through his own alcohol-enhanced bravado. "Gunny asked you a question." Sarah tilted her head slightly, reviewing the previous exchange with the precision of someone trained to remember details under stress. Her memory was trained to perfect accuracy, a necessity when dealing with classified intelligence, where a single misremembered detail could compromise operations. "Actually, he made 2 observations in one statement. No questions were asked," she replied, her tone remaining perfectly level. The correction hung in the air like smoke from a misfired round. Thompson's face flushed red, the kind of embarrassed anger that comes from being outmaneuvered intellectually in front of someone whose approval you desperately seek. Walsh snickered nervously, uncertain whether to be amused by his colleague's discomfort or concerned about the direction the encounter was taking. Morgan's expression darkened as he processed what had just happened. His carefully orchestrated display of dominance had been dissected and dismissed with surgical precision by someone who couldn't weigh more than 120 soaking wet. The humiliation was made worse by the fact that it had occurred in front of his men, undermining the very authority he was trying to demonstrate. "Smart mouth," he said, his voice dropping to a lower register that carried more genuine menace than his earlier bluster. "You think you're clever, staying here with your fancy gadgets playing at being important, while real warriors handle the actual fighting." He reached out and tapped the edge of her bag with one thick finger, the gesture deliberately invasive and threatening. What do you do, sweetheart? Type up reports for some butter bar lieutenant process paperwork while Marines bleed. The question revealed more about Morgan's worldview than he probably intended. Like many combat veterans who had transitioned to peacetime service, he had constructed a hierarchy of worth based on proximity to direct combat. In his mental framework, anyone who didn't carry a rifle into harm's way was fundamentally lesser, regardless of their actual contribution to mission success. Sarah's expression remained unchanged, but something shifted in the quality of her stillness. It was subtle, barely noticeable to anyone who hadn't been trained to read such things. Her weight settled slightly forward on the balls of her feet. Her hands, which had been resting casually on the table, moved to a more neutral position. Her breathing, already controlled, became even more measured. These were the unconscious adjustments of someone who had spent years training for close-quarters combat muscle memory, asserting itself in response to escalating threat indicators. She was still sitting, still appeared relaxed, but every system in her body had shifted to a state of readiness that could transition to action in fractions of a second. "My duties are not your concern," she replied, her voice carrying the same neutral tone, but somehow managing to convey that this particular line of inquiry was now closed. The refusal to be intimidated was like oxygen to Morgan's rage. He was a man whose entire identity was built on the foundation of other people's deference to his size, his rank, and his carefully cultivated reputation for aggressive competence. When that deference was not forthcoming, when someone failed to recognize his dominance in the social hierarchy he had spent decades climbing, the response was both predictable and ugly. "Not my concern." He leaned closer, invading her personal space with the deliberate intensity of a predator testing boundaries. "Everything that happens on this base is my concern, little girl. See, I'm what real military looks like." He straightened up, his chest swelling with the kind of performative masculinity that required an audience. Thompson and Walsh moved closer, sensing the escalation and positioning themselves to prevent any retreat. Around them, the ambient noise of the bar seemed to fade as other patrons became aware that something was developing in the corner booth. "You Navy types, you think you're special with your technical training and your fancy equipment," Morgan continued, his voice gaining volume and vitriol. "But when the shooting starts, when it comes down to real combat, you hide behind your computers while Marines do the actual fighting." The accusation was both personal and institutional, designed to strip away not just Sarah's individual dignity, but her service's contribution to American military operations. It was the kind of inter-service rivalry that existed everywhere in the military, but Morgan was wielding it like a weapon, using it to justify his escalating aggression. Sarah's response was to calmly reach into her bag and pull out her father's manual. She placed it on the table between them, the worn cover and Cyrillic text clearly visible in the bar's amber light. Morgan glanced down at it, his expression shifting from aggressive confidence to puzzled suspicion. "Soviet Signals Intelligence Manual," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet space around their table. "Property of Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, killed in action, Helmand Province, 2003. My father." The simple statement hung in the air like a flag planted in contested ground. Morgan looked from the manual to Sarah's face, trying to reconcile the small woman in front of him with the implications of what she had just revealed. Thompson and Walsh exchanged glances, suddenly less certain about the trajectory of their evening's entertainment. The manual represented more than just a book. In military culture, it was a sacred artifact, a tangible connection to sacrifice and service that transcended rank and branch rivalry. By revealing its provenance, Sarah had transformed the dynamic of the encounter, forcing Morgan to confront the reality that his intended victim was not just another sailor, but the daughter of a fallen warrior. He was studying Russian electronic warfare techniques. Sarah continued, her voice carrying the same neutral tone, but now underlaid with something harder. Trying to understand how insurgents were coordinating attacks with such precision. He documented patterns that had suggested direct Russian intelligence involvement in anti-American operations. She paused, letting the implications sink in. The bar had grown quieter around them, conversations dying as people became aware that something significant was happening in the corner booth. 3 months after he made his final notes in this manual, his convoy was hit by an IED that was triggered using the exact coordination protocols he had been researching. He died trying to save other Marines' lives by understanding the enemy better than anyone else thought necessary. Her voice remained level professional, but there was steel underneath now, the kind of controlled intensity that comes from years of carrying both grief and purpose. So when you talk about who does the real fighting, gunnery sergeant, I'd suggest you might want to reconsider your definitions. The rebuke was delivered with surgical precision, cutting through Morgan's bluster to expose the hollow core beneath. For a moment, he seemed genuinely taken aback, his swagger faltering as he processed the fact that his intended victim had just revealed herself to be the daughter of a fallen warrior whose sacrifice had been both real and recent. But Morgan was a man whose pride was a fragile instrument easily thrown out of tune by anything other than immediate validation. The momentary uncertainty gave way to a different kind of anger, one focused not on establishing dominance, but on restoring it after it had been challenged. The alcohol in his system amplified his emotional response, turning embarrassment into rage. "That's real touching," he said, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy that fooled no one. "But your daddy's not here to protect you now, is he? And carrying around his old books doesn't make you a warrior." The cruelty of the statement landed like a physical blow designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. Several nearby patrons shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that they were witnessing something ugly, something that violated the unwritten codes of military brotherhood. Morgan reached out and lifted the manual from the table, holding it up as if examining a curious artifact. "Let's see what's so important about this dusty old thing." The moment his fingers closed around the manual, the last vestiges of Sarah's professional demeanor fell away. This wasn't just disrespect toward her or her service. This was desecration of her father's memory, violation of the sacrifice that had shaped her entire adult life. Her voice when she spoke carried the kind of quiet authority that comes from knowing exactly how much damage you can inflict and how quickly you can inflict it. "Put it down." The two words were delivered with the precision of coordinates being called in for a fire mission. There was no heat in them, no visible anger, just the kind of absolute certainty that professionals use when giving instructions they expect to be followed without question. Something in her tone should have warned Morgan that he was approaching a line that once crossed could not be uncrossed. Morgan's response was to laugh, a harsh sound that carried no genuine amusement. "Or what? You going to cry to the shore patrol?" He held the manual higher just out of her reach, his actions becoming increasingly theatrical. "Maybe call your mommy." The taunts were crude, juvenile, the kind of bullying that relied on audience participation to be effective. But the audience was no longer with him. The other patrons had recognized that something had shifted, that what had started as inter-service rivalry had become something darker and more personal. "Last warning," Sarah said, rising slowly to her feet. Standing, she looked even smaller next to Morgan's bulk, a fact that seemed to restore his confidence. He was 6'3" and weighed nearly 250, all of it earned through years of disciplined training and aggressive conditioning. She was maybe 5'5" and couldn't weigh more than 120. The physics seemed overwhelmingly in his favor. "No one's saving you now, little girl," he said, his voice carrying the kind of cruel satisfaction that comes from believing you hold all the cards. "This is the real world where size matters and tough guys finish first." That was his final mistake. Sarah didn't attack. She didn't throw a punch or attempt a dramatic martial arts maneuver that might be expected from someone with her training. Instead, she simply stepped forward, closing the distance between them with a movement so economical and precise that it seemed almost casual. Her approach was based on principles her father had taught her during those weekend training sessions. Economy of motion, precision over power, using an opponent's assumptions against them. Her left hand rose to meet his descending wrist, not to block his motion, but to guide it, her fingers finding the cluster of nerves at his radial pulse point with the accuracy of a surgeon. The pressure point technique was something she had learned not in SEAL training, but from her father, who had picked it up from Special Forces medics during his early deployments. The pressure she applied was minimal, barely more than a firm handshake, but the effect was immediate and devastating. A bolt of electrical pain shot up Morgan's arm, his nervous system short-circuiting as precisely applied pressure overwhelmed his motor control. His grip on the manual involuntarily loosened as his brain struggled to process signals that didn't make sense. Sarah's right hand caught the falling manual while her body continued its forward motion, her hip checking Thompson, who had been moving to intervene. The contact was perfectly timed, catching him mid-stride when his balance was compromised by forward momentum. Thompson, off balance and unprepared for the precisely applied force, stumbled backward into a nearby table, sending glasses crashing to the floor with a sound like breaking promises. The sudden noise punctuated the silence that had fallen over the immediate area as other patrons became aware that something significant was happening. Conversations died, heads turned, and the ambient noise of the bar focused down to the small drama playing out in the corner booth. Walsh, seeing his companions neutralized with surgical efficiency, lunged forward with the desperate energy of someone trying to salvage a situation that had already spiraled beyond his understanding. His attack was emotional, uncoordinated, driven more by loyalty to his superior than by tactical thinking. Sarah, her pivot now complete, met his advance not with resistance, but with redirection. Her left hand, now free from Morgan's wrist, guided Walsh's reaching arm, while her right foot hooked behind his ankle in a classical hip toss that used his own momentum against him. The technique was basic judo, something she had learned in high school and refined during military training. Using his forward energy against him, she pulled him forward and down his body, describing a perfect arc before meeting the floor with a solid thump that drove the air from his lungs in an explosive grunt. He landed hard but safely, the throw designed to neutralize rather than injure. The entire sequence had taken less than 8 seconds, and at no point had Sarah thrown a punch, delivered a kick, or used any technique that could be characterized as overtly aggressive. Everything she had done fell within the bounds of defensive action, minimal force applied with maximum efficiency. Morgan, shaking his head to clear the lingering effects of the nerve strike, charged forward with the kind of rage-fueled desperation that comes from having one's worldview suddenly and violently reorganized. His attack was clumsy, emotional-driven, more by wounded pride than tactical thinking. The alcohol in his system had degraded his motor control, making his movements predictable and uncoordinated. Sarah met his charge with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years learning to turn aggression into advantage. Her forearm deflected his wild swing while she stepped into his reach, violating the distance he needed to use his size advantage effectively. Her hand cupped the back of his neck while securing his elbow, establishing the leverage she needed for the final technique. The control hold was simple, elegant, and absolutely effective. A twist that applied pressure to his shoulder joint and cervical spine, forcing him down to his knees with irresistible mechanical advantage. His face ended up inches from the sticky floor, a pained grunt escaping his lips as he found himself completely immobilized. The physics were undeniable, the leverage perfect. Sarah maintained just enough pressure to keep him controlled without causing permanent damage, her training emphasizing restraint, even in the application of superior technique. She held him there for a moment, letting him understand the completeness of his defeat before releasing him and stepping back. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 20 seconds. 3 larger, presumably trained men had been neutralized by someone who looked like she should have been organizing someone's filing system, rather than demonstrating the kind of close-quarters combat techniques that were taught only in very specialized schools to very specific students. The bar was dead silent. Even the jukebox seemed to have run out of songs, its mechanical heartbeat the only sound in a room full of people who were trying to process what they had just witnessed. This wasn't a bar fight. This was a professional demonstration, a clinical application of force that had been both overwhelming in its effectiveness and minimal in its scope. Sarah released Morgan, who slumped to the floor, clutching his shoulder and trying to understand how his evening had gone so catastrophically wrong. She stood calmly, straightened her civilian clothes with the same care she might use to adjust her dress uniform, and picked up her bag from the table. Her father's manual was secure in her hands, unharmed, despite the violence that had surrounded it. Walking to the bar, she placed a $20 bill on the counter, enough to cover her club soda and provide a generous tip. The bartender, a man who had seen his share of military altercations over the years, stared at her with the kind of expression usually reserved for witnessing natural phenomena. Please preserve the security camera footage from the last 15 minutes. Sarah told him, her voice carrying the same professional neutrality she had maintained throughout the confrontation. Base security will be requesting it. The instruction was given with the confidence of someone who understood both military procedure and legal protocol. By ensuring the preservation of video evidence, she was protecting herself against any attempt to mischaracterize what had occurred. The footage would show that she had acted in self-defense, using minimal force to neutralize a threat. She walked toward the exit, stepping carefully around Thompson, who was still trying to extract himself from the wreckage of the table he had encountered. Her movements were unhurried, controlled the demeanor of someone who had accomplished what was necessary and was now moving on to the next phase of her evening. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at Morgan, who was attempting to regain his feet with what remained of his dignity. Her expression was not triumphant or cruel, but rather the professional neutrality of someone who had solved a problem and was now providing feedback on the solution. For future reference, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, the term is Chief Petty Officer, not little girl. And the next time someone tells you their father died fighting for Marines, the appropriate response is thank you for his service. The correction was delivered without emotion, a simple statement of fact that cut through the aftermath of violence with surgical precision. It was not gloating or revenge, but rather instruction. The kind of professional feedback that addressed the root cause of the problem rather than just its symptom. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving behind a tableau of shock humiliation and the kind of silence that follows the collapse of long-held assumptions. Outside, the neon sign continued its restless flickering, casting the same amber shadows it had thrown for decades, indifferent to the small revolution that had just occurred beneath its glow. Sarah walked through the Virginia night toward the senior enlisted barracks, her father's manual secure in her bag, her mind already moving past the confrontation to consider its likely consequences. She had done what was necessary to protect herself and her father's memory, using minimal force and maximum precision. The system would now have to decide whether justice and truth were more important than maintaining comfortable fictions about who belonged where in the military hierarchy. She pulled out her phone and composed a brief text message to Master Chief Sullivan. Incident at Anchor and Eagle, 3 Marines, self-defense, video available, need guidance. The message was sent immediately, beginning the process of institutional notification that would determine how the evening's events were interpreted and handled. Sullivan's response came within minutes. On my way, say nothing until I arrive. The old warrior understood the implications of what had occurred, the potential for a simple self-defense situation to become a political firestorm if not handled properly. Sarah smiled slightly as she climbed the steps to her barracks. Her father had taught her to think several moves ahead, to anticipate consequences and prepare for contingencies. Tonight's confrontation had been unavoidable, but its aftermath would be entirely manageable. She did not look back. Warriors her father had taught her always move forward. The digital display on Sarah's bedside clock read 0547 hours when her secure phone vibrated with an incoming message. She had been awake for 20 minutes already, her internal chronometer calibrated by years of military discipline to wake her before any alarm became necessary. The message was from Master Chief Sullivan, Base JAG Office, 0800, bring everything. Sarah, dressed in her service dress blues with the methodical precision of someone who understood that appearances mattered as much as facts in military justice proceedings. Each ribbon was positioned exactly where regulations specified, each crease sharp enough to cut paper. She was preparing for war, and the uniform was her armor. The knock on her door came at precisely 0630. Master Chief Frank Sullivan stood in the hallway, his weathered face bearing the kind of expression that had been carved by 3 decades of dealing with military crises. At 62, Sullivan carried himself with the economy of motion that marked career special operations personnel. His uniform was as immaculate as hers, but where her ribbons spoke of technical excellence and specialized training, his told the story of a warrior who had served through the twilight of the Cold War and into the modern era of asymmetric warfare. Chief Mitchell, he said formally, then dropped his voice to a more personal register. How are you holding up? Steady, Master Chief, she replied, stepping into the hallway and closing her door. The video evidence should be clear enough. Sullivan's expression darkened slightly. About that, we have a problem. They walked toward the base JAG office through morning air that carried the crisp promise of a Virginia autumn. Around them, the base was coming to life with the controlled urgency that marked military installations worldwide. Personnel moved with purpose toward their assigned duties, most unaware that one of their own was about to face a crisis that would test the very foundations of military justice. The bar owner, Jimmy Kowalski, is claiming his security system had a malfunction last night, Sullivan explained as they walked. Says the hard drives corrupted right around the time of your incident. Remarkable coincidence. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Without video evidence, the encounter would become a matter of competing testimonies. 3 Marines against 1 Navy SEAL. The institutional dynamics alone would make that an uphill battle regardless of the truth. Morgan got to him. She said, it wasn't a question. Looks that way. But here's the interesting part. Kowalski's establishment has been having financial troubles. Behind on his liquor license, owes back taxes to the state. The kind of problems that could be solved by someone with the right connections. Sullivan paused, letting the implications sink in. I made some calls after receiving your text last night, started pulling threads. What I found isn't pretty. They had reached a quiet area between buildings away from passing personnel. Sullivan looked around carefully before continuing, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Morgan didn't act alone last night. This was coordinated. Within an hour of the incident, 12 Marines from his unit had already provided written statements to their command. 12 detailed nearly identical accounts of unprovoked aggression on your part. Sarah's blood ran cold. 12 witness statements prepared and submitted within an hour of the confrontation. That level of coordination required planning, organization, and resources that went well beyond a spontaneous bar fight. Someone told them to be ready, she said. That's my read, but it gets worse. Morgan's company commander is Captain Bradley Hayes. Ring any bells? Sarah's step faltered slightly. She knew that name not from personal experience, but from her father's files. Captain Bradley Hayes had been a lieutenant in Afghanistan during her father's final deployment. He had been mentioned in several intelligence reports as someone who had questioned the value of signals, intelligence operations preferring direct action over what he called electronic warfare fairy tales. He was there when my father died, Sarah said quietly, part of the unit that was supposed to benefit from Dad's intelligence analysis. That's right, and according to the after-action reports I've managed to access, Lieutenant Hayes filed a formal complaint about your father's work 3 days before the convoy was hit. Claimed the intelligence was unreliable and was putting Marines at unnecessary risk by sending them into areas where the enemy had superior communications coordination. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her father hadn't just died in a random attack. He had died while his own intelligence work was being actively undermined by the very people he was trying to protect. The bitter irony was that Hayes had probably survived because he had been back at the forward operating base filing paperwork complaints while better men were dying in the field. So this isn't random, Sarah said, her voice tight with controlled anger. Hayes sees my name on the roster, recognizes it, and decides to finish what he started 20 years ago. That's my assessment, Sullivan confirmed grimly. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Sullivan pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a series of documents he had compiled overnight. Her father's personnel file, Lieutenant Hayes' complaint forms, and most damning, a series of emails between Hayes and his superiors questioning the value of Mitchell's electronic warfare theories. Your father was getting too close to something, Chief. These emails suggest he had identified Russian advisors working with the insurgent forces, providing them with advanced communications equipment. Hayes' complaints weren't about operational effectiveness. They were about protecting something Hayes didn't want exposed. Sarah studied the documents, her training in intelligence analysis, allowing her to see patterns that others might miss. The timing of Hayes' complaints corresponded precisely with periods when her father had reported unusual enemy coordination. Every time Staff Sergeant Mitchell had documented sophisticated communications patterns, Lieutenant Hayes had filed reports questioning the validity of the intelligence. Hayes was compromised, Sarah said quietly. Either willingly or unwillingly, he was working to suppress Dad's discoveries. I can't prove that, Sullivan replied carefully, but the pattern is suspicious enough to warrant investigation. Unfortunately, we won't get that investigation unless we can survive what's happening today. They had reached the JAG office, a sterile building that housed the administrative machinery of military justice. Inside, careers were made and destroyed, with the stroke of a pen, lives reshaped by the interpretation of regulations and the quality of legal representation. Sarah had never expected to find herself here as anything other than a witness in someone else's proceedings. The waiting area was deliberately intimidating, designed to reinforce the gravity of military justice proceedings. Portraits of distinguished military lawyers gazed down from the walls, their expressions conveying the weight of tradition and the unforgiving nature of military law. Sarah and Sullivan were directed to hard wooden chairs that seemed calculated to increase anxiety while they waited for their appointment. At precisely 0800, they were ushered into the office of Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torres, the base staff judge advocate. Torres was a woman in her early 40s whose reputation for fairness was matched only by her intolerance for games and politics. She had built her career on the principle that military law existed to serve military effectiveness, not to protect the comfortable or powerful. Chief Mitchell, Torres said, gesturing to the chairs across from her desk. Master Chief Sullivan, I've read the initial reports from last night's incident. Before we proceed, I want to make sure you understand the gravity of the situation. Torres opened a thick folder that contained what Sarah assumed were the statements from Morgan and his companions. The folder was substantial, suggesting far more documentation than a simple bar fight should have generated. Gunnery Sergeant Morgan has filed formal charges alleging that you assaulted 3 Marines without provocation. Torres began, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone who had presided over too many similar proceedings. His account describes you as unstable, potentially dangerous, and unsuitable for continued military service. She looked up from the paperwork, her expression neutral but not unsympathetic. His version of events has the support of 12 witnesses, all Marines from Force Reconnaissance Company Bravo, who were present at the Anchor and Eagle last night. They've provided sworn statements corroborating his account of unprovoked aggression on your part. Torres spread the witness statements across her desk like playing cards, each one bearing the official seal and signature that gave it legal weight. Sergeant Thompson states that you became agitated when approached in a friendly manner. Sergeant Walsh confirms that you made threatening statements before attacking. Private First Class Rodriguez describes you as exhibiting signs of mental instability. The names kept coming, each statement building a coordinated narrative that painted Sarah as an unstable aggressor who had attacked innocent Marines. The level of detail was remarkable, with each witness providing specific observations about her demeanor, her words, and her actions that aligned perfectly with the others. Ma'am, Sullivan interjected, his voice carrying the weight of his years and experience. With respect, this level of coordination suggests premeditation. 12 detailed witness statements, all submitted within 2 hours of the incident, all telling essentially the same story. That's not how genuine witness testimony works. Torres nodded slowly. I've noticed the coordination as well, Master Chief. It's unusual but not necessarily illegal. Military personnel are trained to observe and report accurately. It's possible they're all simply telling the truth. It's also possible they're all following orders, Sullivan replied bluntly. The tension in the room ratcheted up several degrees. Torres leaned back in her chair, studying both Sarah and Sullivan with the calculating gaze of someone trying to separate truth from politics. Even if that were true, Torres said carefully, proving it would require evidence that these statements were fabricated. Without the security camera footage from the bar, we have no independent verification of what occurred. Sarah reached into her portfolio and removed her father's manual, placing it carefully on Torres' desk. Ma'am, this belonged to my father, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell. He was killed in Afghanistan in 2003 while conducting signals intelligence operations. Torres examined this manual. The manual, her expression shifting as she recognized the significance of what she was seeing. The Cyrillic text and Soviet military markings immediately identified it as intelligence material of potential historical importance. Soviet-era communications doctrine, Torres observed. This is quite a find, but I'm not sure how it relates to last night's incidents. Morgan took it from me during the confrontation, Sarah explained. It's not just a book, ma'am. It represents my father's sacrifice, his attempt to understand enemy communications networks that were killing American personnel. When Morgan grabbed it and made crude jokes about my father's death, that's when the situation escalated. Even if that's true, Torres said carefully, it doesn't justify assault. You could have reported the harassment through proper channels. Ma'am, Sullivan said, his voice taking on the edge that came when old soldiers reached the limits of their patience. What would you have done if someone desecrated your father's grave? The analogy hung in the air like cordite after a firefight. Torres looked from the manual to Sarah's face, recognizing the emotional weight behind what had occurred. For a moment, the rigid structure of military justice bent slightly to accommodate the human reality of loss and honor. A sharp knock on the door interrupted the proceeding. Torres's aide entered with an expression of barely controlled urgency. Ma'am, General Hayes requests all parties in her office immediately. Oracle Gambit has encountered significant problems. The aide's language was carefully neutral, but his expression conveyed the kind of concern that came when exercises designed to demonstrate American military superiority encountered unexpected difficulties. Torres gathered her files with the efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. Chief Mitchell, this conversation is far from over, she said. But General Hayes' request takes priority. The walk to the general's office felt like a death march. Around them, the base was transitioning from routine operations to the controlled chaos of Oracle Gambit. Personnel moved with increased urgency. Vehicles carried specialized equipment to staging areas, and the ambient radio chatter carried the particular intensity that marked major military exercises. Sarah noticed that many of the personnel they passed seemed aware of who she was. Conversation stopped as she approached, resuming in whispers after she had passed. Word of the previous night's incident had spread through the close-knit military community with the speed that only gossip could achieve. "They're looking at me like I'm already convicted," Sarah observed quietly. "Let them look," Sullivan replied grimly. "In about 6 hours, they're going to need you more than they've ever needed anyone. Oracle Gambit is about to become a disaster, and you're the only person on this base who can prevent it." General Patricia Hayes' office was a shrine to military excellence, decorated with awards and commendations that spoke of a career spent in service to American military superiority. At 54, Hayes had broken through barriers that had once seemed impossible for women in the military, earning her position through competence that no one could question. But today her expression was deeply troubled. The reports on her desk spoke of problems that threatened to turn Oracle Gambit from a demonstration of American capability into an embarrassing failure. Multiple computer screens displayed real-time data from the exercise, and none of it looked encouraging. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hayes said without preamble, as the group assembled, "we have a crisis. Oracle Gambit was designed to test our ability to counter sophisticated electronic warfare attacks. The Red Team is using techniques that we haven't seen before, and our conventional countermeasures are proving completely ineffective." She gestured to a large display screen that showed a map of the exercise area. Red icons indicated known enemy positions, but they were sparse and constantly changing, suggesting that American forces were operating largely blind. "In the first 4 hours of the exercise, we've lost communication with 3 separate units. Our electronic warfare specialists are reporting complete inability to locate or intercept Red Team communications. They're describing it as fighting ghosts." Captain Bradley Hayes entered the office at that moment, followed by Gunnery Sergeant Morgan. Sarah felt her jaw tighten at the sight of the man who had orchestrated her professional destruction, but she maintained her composure with the discipline that had carried her through years of challenging assignments. Hayes was exactly what Sarah had expected, based on her father's reports, a man in his late 40s whose bearing suggested someone who had earned his position through political acumen rather than technical excellence. His expression carried the particular smugness of someone who believed he was about to witness the vindication of his long-held prejudices. Morgan looked significantly worse than he had the previous evening. His face bore the clear evidence of their encounter, with bruising around his jaw and a stiffness in his posture that suggested lingering effects from the joint manipulation Sarah had applied. His eyes burned with the promise of revenge, but he remained silent in the presence of superior officers. General Captain Hayes said formally, "I want to register my strong objection to Chief Mitchell's presence at this briefing. Given the serious charges pending against her, I believe her continued access to classified exercise information represents a security risk." The accusation hit Sarah like a slap. Hayes wasn't just trying to remove her from the exercise, he was questioning her loyalty, her clearance, her fitness to serve. It was the kind of character assassination that could end careers even if formal charges were eventually dismissed. "Noted, Captain," General Hayes replied curtly. "However, Chief Mitchell remains cleared for this briefing pending formal action on those charges." She turned her attention back to the display screen, which showed an increasingly dire tactical situation. The Red Team leader is a former East German communications specialist named Klaus Weber. Intelligence suggests he served with the Stasi's Signals Directorate during the 1980s before immigrating to the United States after reunification. He's been hired as a contractor to provide realistic opposition for our exercises. Sarah felt a chill of recognition. She knew that name not from personal experience, but from her father's research. Klaus Weber had been mentioned in several intelligence reports as a person of interest, someone who had maintained connections to Russian intelligence services even after his supposed defection. Weber is using what he calls the Iron Curtain Protocol, General Hayes continued, a communications technique that makes conventional signals intelligence completely useless. Our operators describe it as the most sophisticated electronic warfare they have ever encountered. Sullivan leaned forward slightly. General, may I ask what specific techniques Weber is employing? From what we can determine, he's using a form of quantum frequency hopping that changes encryption keys faster than our systems can track. But there's more. He's also employing psychological warfare techniques using our own communications protocols against us to create confusion and mistrust among our units. Sarah's mind was racing. The Iron Curtain Protocol wasn't just advanced technology, it was a psychological warfare technique that her father had encountered in Afghanistan. The manual she carried contained specific references to Soviet efforts to develop communication systems that could induce paranoia and confusion among enemy forces. Ma'am, Sarah said carefully, the techniques you're describing match documentation my father captured 20 years ago. Soviet psychological warfare doctrine combined with quantum encryption technology. General Hayes turned to face her directly. You're telling me that a technique developed in the 1980s is defeating our most advanced electronic warfare capabilities? Not exactly, ma'am. Weber is using psychological principles that the Soviets developed, but he's applying them with technology they never had access to. The basic doctrine creates confusion and mistrust, while the quantum encryption makes traditional intercept methods impossible. Sullivan stepped forward. General Chief Mitchell has spent 15 years studying these exact techniques. She's probably the only person on this base who understands both the psychological and technical aspects of what Weber is doing. Captain Hayes's expression had grown increasingly dark as the conversation progressed. General, I must protest. Chief Mitchell's claims about her expertise are unsubstantiated. Her father's supposed research has never been independently verified, and her current mental state makes her unreliable. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge to single combat. Hayes was no longer content to simply remove Sarah from the exercise. He was attacking the foundation of her professional identity, questioning the value of her father's sacrifice, and suggesting that her specialized knowledge was worthless. Captain General Hayes said, her voice carrying a warning edge, I'm less concerned with interdepartmental politics than I am with mission success. Oracle Gambit isn't just an exercise, it's being monitored by congressional oversight committees who are looking for reasons to cut our electronic warfare budget. She gestured to another screen that showed funding projections and budget allocations. Failure here means reduced capability, fewer personnel, less advanced equipment. We're not just playing war games, we're fighting for the future of American electronic warfare capability. The stakes were now clear. Oracle Gambit had evolved from a training exercise into a demonstration of American military competence before an audience that controlled funding and resources. Failure would have consequences that extended far beyond professional embarrassment. There's one more factor, General Hayes continued, her expression growing even more serious. Intelligence suggests that foreign observers may be monitoring our communications during this exercise. Success isn't just about training, it's about protecting classified techniques from potential adversaries. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a heavy pack. This wasn't just about her career or personal vindication. American military communications security was potentially at stake, along with the lives of personnel who depended on that security in operational environments. Ma'am, she said, I understand the stakes, but I need access to real-time intelligence feeds and the ability to coordinate with field units if I'm going to be effective against Weber's techniques. Captain Hayes stepped forward aggressively. General, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Chief Mitchell is making demands based on unproven expertise while facing serious criminal charges. She's attempting to leverage this crisis for personal gain. Actually, Sarah replied, her voice remaining level despite the provocation, I'm trying to prevent a national security disaster. But if Captain Hayes prefers to see Oracle Gambit fail, rather than accept help from Navy personnel, that's his prerogative. The confrontation was now open, professional courtesy stripped away to reveal the underlying conflict showing between competing visions of military effectiveness. Hayes represented the traditional approach that valued hierarchy and conventional tactics, while Sarah embodied the newer paradigm that emphasized technical innovation and adaptive thinking. Enough, General Hayes said sharply. Here's what's going to happen. Chief Mitchell will participate in Oracle Gambit from a remote monitoring station. She'll have access to intelligence feeds, but will work independently of the main operations center. Sullivan's expression showed his understanding of what this meant. Remote participation would isolate Sarah from the real-time coordination that made electronic warfare effective. It was a compromise that appeared to address everyone's concerns while actually setting her up for failure. Ma'am, Sullivan said carefully, electronic warfare requires collaborative coordination. Working in isolation will significantly reduce Chief Mitchell's effectiveness. Nevertheless, General Hayes replied, given the circumstances, it's the best I can offer. Chief Mitchell has 1 hour to demonstrate value. If she can provide actionable intelligence about Weber's techniques, she'll be integrated into the main operations. If not, she'll be removed from the exercise pending resolution of the charges against her. The ultimatum was clear. Sarah had 1 hour to prove herself against an enemy using techniques that had baffled the base's best electronic warfare specialists. She would be working alone with limited resources against an adversary who had decades of experience in exactly the kind of psychological and technical warfare that had killed her father. As they left General Hayes's office, Sullivan's expression was grim. They're setting you up to fail, he said quietly. 1 hour, no support, impossible technical challenges. Even if you succeed, they'll find ways to minimize your contribution. Sarah nodded, but her mind was already working on the problem. Her father had faced similar challenges in Afghanistan, isolated from command structures, that didn't understand his work fighting enemies who used unconventional techniques against conventional thinking. She pulled out her father's manual and opened to the section on psychological warfare doctrine. The pages contained detailed analysis of Soviet techniques designed to create confusion and mistrust among enemy forces. But they also contained something else, her father's handwritten notes about countermeasures, techniques for turning psychological warfare against itself. Master Chief, she said quietly, I need you to tell me everything you remember about Klaus Weber. Not from official reports, but from your personal experience during the Cold War. Sullivan's expression shifted as he accessed memories that had been classified for decades. Weber was a problem even back then. He didn't just intercept communications, he turned them into weapons. Made units distrust their own command structures, created phantom orders that led to friendly fire incidents. How was he stopped? He wasn't really. The wall came down, the Stasi collapsed, and Weber disappeared into the chaos of reunification. We always assumed he'd gone to ground, maybe been eliminated by his own people. Sarah felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. Weber hadn't disappeared after the Cold War. He had evolved, adapting his psychological warfare techniques to modern technology and finding new employers who valued his specialized skills. He's been waiting 20 years for this, she said quietly. Oracle Gambit isn't just an exercise he's been hired to disrupt. It's his chance to prove that Western technology can't overcome Soviet psychological doctrine. The walk to her assigned workspace felt like a descent into isolation. The temporary operations center was located in the basement of the communications building, a windowless room equipped with basic monitoring equipment and a single secure terminal. It was exactly the kind of setup designed to ensure failure while maintaining plausible deniability about the reasons for that failure. But as Sarah connected to the exercise network and began analyzing the intelligence feeds, she felt something she hadn't expected: opportunity. For 20 years, she had carried the weight of her father's unfinished work. Today, she would have the chance to complete what he had started to prove, that understanding the enemy's psychology was more important than matching their technology. Klaus Weber was using sophisticated techniques, but sophistication often bred predictable patterns. Her father had taught her to look for the human element in electronic warfare, the psychological signatures that revealed themselves even through the most advanced encryption. She opened her father's manual to the section on frequency analysis and began to work. Somewhere in the electromagnetic spectrum, Weber was leaving traces of his presence. She just had to know how to look for them. The countdown clock on her terminal showed 57 minutes remaining. 57 minutes to vindicate her father's work, save her career, and prevent a national security disaster. She was about to demonstrate that sometimes the most powerful weapon in electronic warfare wasn't technology at all, it was understanding. The isolation of the basement operations center felt like being buried alive. 57 minutes remained on Sarah's countdown timer, each second marking another step toward professional execution or vindication. The single terminal hummed quietly in the sterile room, its screen displaying cascading data that represented the electronic battlefield where Oracle Gambit was unfolding above her head. Sarah spread her father's manual across the small desk, its yellowed pages a stark contrast to the modern equipment surrounding her. 20 years of accumulated knowledge marginalia and desperate insights stared back at her. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell had died trying to understand Klaus Weber's psychological warfare techniques. His daughter would finish what he had started. The intelligence feeds painted a picture of systematic American failure. 3 units had lost communication entirely, their last transmissions on fragmenting into electronic gibberish before going silent. 2 more reported receiving contradictory orders that had nearly led to friendly fire incidents. The Red Team's Iron Curtain protocol wasn't just blocking communications, it was weaponizing them. Sarah's fingers moved across the keyboard with the precision of a surgeon accessing frequency analysis tools that most operators never learned to use. She wasn't looking for Weber's transmissions directly. That would be impossible with quantum encryption changing keys faster than any conventional system could track. Instead, she was searching for something her father had taught her to recognize: the psychological signature hidden within the chaos. Electronic warfare isn't about technology, she whispered to herself, repeating her father's words from those long-ago training sessions. It's about understanding how the human mind processes information under stress. The first breakthrough came 18 minutes into her analysis. Weber's quantum frequency hopping wasn't random. It followed mathematical patterns based on psychological stress responses. Every time American units experienced communication disruption, the hopping sequence shifted to frequencies that human operators would instinctively avoid during crisis situations. Weber was using the Americans' own training against them, exploiting the psychological protocols that made military communications effective under normal circumstances. When stressed radio operators naturally gravitated toward specific frequency ranges that felt safe based on their training, Weber was anticipating these choices and jamming them preemptively. Sarah opened her father's manual to a section titled Cognitive Load Manipulation in Electronic Warfare. The pages contained detailed analysis of Soviet experiments in psychological manipulation through communication disruption. Her father had documented how enemy forces could induce paranoia and confusion by exploiting the human tendency to assume pattern and meaning in random events. The Iron Curtain Protocol, she murmured, understanding flooding through her like cold water. Weber isn't just hiding his communications, he's making our people see patterns that don't exist. She pulled up the communication logs from the units that had reported contradictory orders. The messages were genuine, transmitted through legitimate American encryption protocols, but their timing and content were designed to create maximum confusion. Weber was intercepting real American communications, analyzing their content for psychological weak points, then retransmitting modified versions that appeared authentic while sowing seeds of doubt and mistrust. The technique was brilliant in its simplicity. By the time field commanders realized the orders were fake, they had already begun to question the authenticity of all subsequent communications. Weber was turning the American command structure's strength, its reliance on clear hierarchical communication, into a weapon against itself. Sarah's analysis revealed the full scope of Weber's psychological warfare campaign. He was using a 3-layered approach that combined quantum encryption, predictive psychological manipulation, and exploitation of American military culture. The first layer made his own communications invisible. The second layer anticipated American responses and countered them preemptively. The third layer weaponized American communications against themselves. But her father's research had identified a weakness in the Soviet approach to psychological warfare. The techniques required constant, real-time analysis of enemy responses, which meant Weber needed to maintain continuous surveillance of American communications. That surveillance would leave traces, electromagnetic shadows, that could be detected by someone who knew how to look for them. Sarah wrote a custom algorithm based on her father's theoretical work designed to identify the secondary electromagnetic signatures created by Weber's surveillance equipment. The program analyzed not the primary communications traffic, but the subtle distortions that surveillance created in the electromagnetic spectrum. The basement room's temperature seemed to drop as she worked, sweat beading on her forehead despite the chill. 43 minutes remained on her countdown timer. Above her head, Oracle Gambit was sliding toward catastrophic failure, taking American electronic warfare credibility with it. Her algorithm began producing results. Faint traces of surveillance activity, barely detectable patterns in the electromagnetic noise that indicated Weber's monitoring equipment was operating from 3 separate locations. The signals were weak, masked by sophisticated counter-surveillance techniques, but they were there. Sarah cross-referenced the surveillance signatures with geographic data from the exercise area. Weber wasn't operating from a single command post. He was using a distributed network that allowed him to monitor American communications from multiple angles simultaneously. The technique provided redundancy and made him nearly impossible to locate using conventional methods. But it also created a weakness. The distributed network required precise coordination between the 3 monitoring stations, which meant Weber needed a secure command and control channel that couldn't be compromised by his own psychological warfare techniques. That channel would use different encryption protocols, older and more reliable systems that predated quantum technology. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind processing patterns and possibilities at the speed that came from years of specialized training. She identified the likely frequency ranges for Weber's command channel and began analyzing the traffic patterns that connected his 3 monitoring stations. The breakthrough came with 31 minutes remaining on her countdown timer. Hidden within the quantum noise of Weber's primary operations was a narrow-band signal using Cold War-era encryption protocols. The signal was weak, heavily masked, but it carried the rhythmic signature of coordinated command traffic. "Got you," Sarah whispered. Weber's command channel was using a technique called temporal frequency shifting, a Soviet method that moved critical communications to different frequencies based on time-based algorithms. It was reliable, proven technology that had been developed before quantum encryption existed. Weber was using it because he couldn't risk having his own command communications subjected to the chaos he was inflicting on American forces. Sarah's analysis revealed the mathematical foundation of Weber's temporal shifting algorithm. It was based on Cold War-era Soviet protocols that her father had documented in his manual techniques that had been considered obsolete for decades, but were now providing the backbone for the most sophisticated electronic warfare attack ever conducted against American forces. She began writing a second algorithm, this one designed to predict Weber's frequency shifts and intercept his command communications. The work required her to think like a Soviet signals intelligence officer from the 1980s to understand the psychological and mathematical principles that guided their approach to secure communications. With 27 minutes remaining, Sarah achieved her first successful intercept of Weber's command channel. The communications were in German, heavily coded, but their content confirmed everything she had suspected. Weber was coordinating a final phase of his attack that would completely cripple American communications within the next hour. The intercepted messages revealed Weber's ultimate objective. Oracle Gambit wasn't just a training exercise he had been hired to disrupt, it was a demonstration for potential clients who were evaluating his services for real-world operations. Weber was using American military personnel as unknowing participants in a sales presentation for his psychological warfare capabilities. Sarah felt a surge of cold rage. Weber wasn't just defeating American forces, he was humiliating them for profit, turning their dedication and training into a marketing tool for enemies of the United States. The realization crystallized her resolve. This had become personal in ways that transcended career ambitions or professional vindication. She opened a secure communication channel to the main operations center, knowing that her transmission would be monitored by General Hayes, Captain Hayes, and everyone else who had written her off as a failed experiment. Her message was brief, professional, and devastating in its implications. "Control, this is Mitchell. I have located and penetrated Red Team Command and Control. Request immediate patch to Exercise Coordinator for target package delivery." The response came within seconds, General Hayes' voice crackling through the speaker with barely controlled excitement. "Mitchell, confirm your status. Are you saying you've found Weber?" "Affirmative, ma'am. Weber is operating from three coordinated positions using distributed surveillance and quantum encryption for primary operations, but relying on Cold War-era temporal frequency shifting for command and control. I have real-time intercept capability of his coordination channel. The silence that followed was profound. Sarah could imagine the scene in the main operations center, dozens of the military's best electronic warfare specialists trying to process the fact that the problem they couldn't solve had been cracked by someone working alone in a basement with equipment they considered obsolete. Mitchell, General Hayes said carefully, "I need you to be absolutely certain. We're about to commit significant resources based on your analysis." "Ma'am, I'm uploading my analysis and intercept logs now." Weber is using three monitoring stations positioned at grid coordinates 847-291-923-156 and 774-398. His command post is mobile, but I can track it through the coordination traffic. He's preparing for a final attack that will target our exercise command structure directly. Sarah's uploads included not just her current analysis, but her father's original research that had made the breakthrough possible. 20 years of accumulated knowledge refined by modern analytical techniques and validated by real-world application against the most sophisticated electronic warfare attack ever mounted against American forces. General Hayes's voice carried a new tone when she responded. "Mitchell, you're being patched through to field commanders. Guide them to targets." The transition from isolation to integration was instantaneous. Sarah's basement workspace became the coordination center for a counterattack that would either validate American electronic warfare doctrine or expose its fundamental weaknesses. Her voice became the guide for units that had been fighting blind for hours. "Dragon 6, this is Overwatch," Sarah said using the tactical call sign that had been assigned to her analysis station. "Vector 127 for 2.3 kilometers to grid 847-291. You are approaching Red Team Surveillance Station Alpha. Weber will detect your approach and initiate countermeasures in approximately 4 minutes." The field commander's response crackled with static intention. "Overwatch, how can you be certain of Red Team positioning? We've had no reliable intelligence for 3 hours. Dragon 6 Red Team is using psychological warfare techniques that depend on real-time surveillance of your communications. That surveillance creates electromagnetic signatures that can be tracked if you know where to look. I know where to look." Sarah's predictions proved accurate with mathematical precision. Weber's surveillance station detected Dragon 6's approach exactly 4 minutes after her warning, initiating jamming protocols that would have been devastating if the American unit hadn't been prepared for them. Instead of communication disruption, the jamming revealed the exact position of Weber's equipment. "Dragon 6 has positive identification on Red Team surveillance equipment," the field commander reported, "initiating neutralization protocols. 2 down, 1 to go." Sarah shifted her attention to Weber's remaining surveillance stations, but her analysis revealed something that sent a chill through her professional composure. Weber had detected her counter-surveillance and was adapting his tactics in real time. "Control, this is Overwatch," Sarah transmitted urgently. "Red Team leader is aware of compromise. He's shifting to backup protocols that will make him significantly harder to track." Weber's response was immediate and sophisticated. His remaining surveillance stations went dark, cutting their electromagnetic signatures to levels that would have been undetectable without Sarah's specialized analysis tools. But he also did something else. He began transmitting false command signals designed to create phantom targets for American forces. "He's trying to turn our own success against us," Sarah realized. Weber was using the Americans' newfound confidence to set them up for an ambush that would restore his psychological dominance. Sarah's counter-response required her to think like Weber, to anticipate his psychological manipulation techniques and turn them against him. She began transmitting carefully crafted false intelligence that appeared to confirm Weber's phantom targets, while actually guiding American forces toward his real positions. The electronic chess match that followed was conducted at the speed of light, with moves and counter-moves measured in milliseconds. Sarah found herself engaged in direct intellectual combat with one of the most sophisticated electronic warfare specialists in the world, using her father's research as both weapon and shield. Weber's expertise was formidable, his experience gained through decades of real-world operations against Western intelligence services. But Sarah possessed something Weber couldn't match: intimate knowledge of his own psychological techniques, gained through 20 years of studying her father's research into Soviet electronic warfare doctrine. The decisive moment came when Weber attempted to use the Iron Curtain Protocol's final phase, a complete electromagnetic shutdown designed to create total communication chaos. It was his ultimate weapon, the technique that would demonstrate the superiority of psychological warfare over technological advancement. Sarah had been expecting this move. Her father's manual contained detailed analysis of the psychological conditions required for total communication shutdown. The technique required Weber to maintain absolute electromagnetic control for a minimum of 30 seconds, while American forces panicked and lost coordination. Instead of panic, Sarah provided calm, clear guidance that turned Weber's shutdown into a trap. All stations, this is Overwatch. Red Team is implementing total communication shutdown. Maintain current positions and wait for electromagnetic signature spike that will reveal final target location. Weber's shutdown protocol required massive power consumption that created exactly the electromagnetic signature Sarah had predicted. For 30 seconds, he became the most visible target on the electronic battlefield, his position revealed with precision that made targeting trivial. All stations target located. Grid 689443. Weber is mobile but contained within 200-meter radius. Execute neutralization protocols. The convergence was swift and decisive. American forces that had been fighting blind for hours suddenly possessed perfect intelligence about their primary target. Weber's psychological warfare techniques, so effective against confused and isolated units, proved useless against coordinated forces operating with real-time intelligence. Control this is Dragon 6. Red Team leader is neutralized. Exercise terminated. American forces maintain full communication capability. The silence that followed was profound. Oracle Gambit had been transformed from humiliating failure to decisive victory in less than an hour. Sarah's analysis had not just located Weber's forces, it had demonstrated that American electronic warfare capabilities could counter the most sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques available. Sarah leaned back in her chair, feeling 20 years of accumulated tension drain from her shoulders. Her father's research had been validated. Weber's attack had been defeated, and Oracle Gambit had been saved from disaster. But more importantly, she had proved that understanding the enemy's psychology was more valuable than matching their technology. The basement door opened and General Hayes entered, followed by the entire Oracle Gambit command staff. Their expressions ranged from amazement to professional respect, but all carried the unmistakable acknowledgement that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Chief Mitchell, General Hayes said formally, "You've just provided the most impressive demonstration of electronic warfare analysis I've seen in 30 years of service. How did you do it?" Sarah gestured to her father's manual, still open on the desk beside her modern equipment. "Ma'am, Klaus Weber was using psychological warfare techniques that were documented by my father 20 years ago. The technology was different, but the human psychology was identical. Weber's greatest strength, his understanding of how people think under stress, became his weakness once we understood his methods." General Hayes picked up the manual, examining its worn pages with new respect. "This Soviet-era documentation enabled you to defeat quantum encryption and distributed surveillance." "Not exactly, ma'am. Weber's quantum encryption was unbreakable using conventional methods, but he needed to coordinate his operations, which required reliable communications that couldn't be subject to his own psychological warfare techniques. That coordination channel used older, more predictable technology that could be analyzed using my father's research." Captain Hayes stepped forward, his expression troubled, but no longer hostile. "Chief Mitchell, I owe you an apology. I was wrong to question your capabilities or your father's research. What you've accomplished today is extraordinary." The apology carried weight beyond simple professional courtesy. Hayes was acknowledging not just Sarah's current success, but the validity of her father's work and the injustice of his earlier dismissal of Signal's intelligence capabilities. "Sir," Sarah replied formally, "my father died trying to protect Marines. Today proved that his sacrifice had value." Sullivan appeared in the doorway, his weathered face showing the kind of pride that came from watching a protege exceed all expectations. "Chief, there's something else you need to know. The security footage from the Anchor and Eagle has been recovered. The revelation transformed the atmosphere in the room instantly. Sarah's tactical victory in Oracle Gambit was now joined by the promise of legal vindication for the charges that had threatened to destroy her career. Jimmy Kowalski decided that his establishment's reputation was more important than whatever pressure had been applied to him. Sullivan continued, "The footage clearly shows that you acted in self-defense against 3 Marines who had physically surrounded you and were threatening violence." Gunnery Sergeant Morgan, who had been standing quietly in the background, stepped forward with an expression that mixed resignation with something that might have been respect. "Chief Mitchell," he said formally, "I was wrong to confront you last night. I was wrong to disrespect your father's memory. I was wrong to file false charges. I request permission to withdraw my complaint." The moment carried the weight of institutional justice reasserting itself. Morgan's acknowledgement wasn't just personal, it represented the recognition that competence and character mattered more than rank or service rivalry. Gunnery Sergeant Cicero replied, "Your request is noted, but the charges were never really about last night. They were about whether the military values truth over convenience." General Hayes closed her father's manual, carefully treating it with the respect due to a historical artifact. "Chief Mitchell, I'm assigning you to lead a new electronic warfare research division. Your mission will be to develop countermeasures against psychological warfare techniques like those Weber employed." The assignment represented more than career advancement. It was validation of everything Sarah's father had worked toward. His research would become the foundation for American defensive capabilities against enemies who use psychology as a weapon. "Ma'am," Sarah said, "I'd like to request Master Chief Sullivan as my senior advisor. His experience with Cold War-era Soviet techniques will be invaluable." Sullivan's expression showed his understanding that this represented the culmination of both their careers. Together, they would build on James Mitchell's legacy, ensuring that American forces would never again be vulnerable to the kind of psychological manipulation that had killed him. 3 days later, Sarah stood in the base cemetery placing fresh flowers on a headstone that bore her father's name and the simple inscription, "Signals Intelligence Specialist, died in service to country." The morning was clear and cold, typical of Virginia in late autumn. Master Chief Sullivan joined her carrying a small wooden box that contained the official documentation of her father's posthumous commendation for intelligence gathering that had saved American lives. The recognition had taken 20 years to arrive, but it was complete and unqualified. "He would be proud," Sullivan said simply, "not just of what you accomplished, but of how you accomplished it. You finished his work." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of legacy and responsibility settling into something that felt like peace. Her father's research would live on, protecting future generations of American military personnel from enemies who sought to use psychology as a weapon. The Oracle Gambit after-action reports would become required reading at electronic warfare schools throughout the American military. Klaus Weber's techniques would be studied, understood, and countered. Sarah's analysis would provide the foundation for defensive capabilities that would protect American forces for decades to come. As she walked away from the cemetery, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from the Pacific Fleet's Intelligence Directorate. A new electronic warfare challenge was emerging in the South China Sea with characteristics that suggested foreign adversaries were adapting Weber's techniques for real-world operations. Sarah smiled. The work never ended, but now she was ready for it. Her father's legacy was secure, his research validated, his sacrifice honored. The quiet professional had finally received the recognition he deserved through the accomplishments of the daughter who had carried his mission forward. The electromagnetic spectrum held no more ghosts. Only signals waiting to be understood, patterns waiting to be decoded, and enemies waiting to be defeated by those who understood that the most powerful weapons were knowledge, understanding, and the courage to see truth clearly in the chaos.